Well, hello there. My name is Tom Richter. I'm the pastor of New Hope Christian Church in Queens, New York. Last year, I made a Good Friday devotional thought for the members of my church to try to encourage them as they thought about and reflected on Jesus' sacrifice on the cross on Good Friday, and wanted to do the same thing this year. So hello to all the New Hopers, and if this video happens to be shared beyond the members of New Hope, hello to you as well, and I hope that you are encouraged and blessed. This year I want to talk about Good Friday as having, really as at its foundation, a sort of presupposition. Something that you have to sort of grant before the rest of Good Friday makes sense. And the thing that you have to grant, the thing you have to concede before anything else makes sense, is you have to presume that every man, woman, boy, and girl, every human being that's ever lived, that's ever going to live, will one day have to give an account for the way they lived. That a man, a woman, they've got to answer for the things that they've done, that they've left undone. Christians believe that they're going to answer, that we are all going to answer God. We're going to stand before God. But even if you're not a Christian, I think you could grant that there should be justice in the world. There should be a sense of accountability, of personal responsibility, that people should have to answer for what they've done. Good Friday has a lot to do with that thought. So how does Good Friday relate to that thought that every man, woman, boy, and girl will have to give an answer for the way they live? They'll have to be held accountable for the way they've lived. Well, we'll get to that in just a second. Before we do, I want to share a story. This is one of those old preacher stories. I've heard it from different pastors. I think credit goes to Harry Ironside, who was a longtime pastor in Chicago. But anyway, it goes like this. Many, many years ago, in the time of the Russian czars, we read about Tsar Nicholas, and he was there overseeing, just like our president today, commander-in-chief over all those armies. Because of some family relations, a young man gets put in charge of being a paymaster of one of the large brigades of his army, a large division. So he's essentially the accountant, a treasurer. The young man's character was not up to the task, however, and he squanders all his money. He's a compulsive gambler. He wastes all his money in gambling, wild living, and then thinks the only way I'm going to be able to pay this back is if I just borrow from the Army's treasury. And of course, he embezzles those funds, steals them. And instead of that being his salvation, like is always the case, sin just leads to a deeper spiral of more sin, and he's forced to lie and cover up, borrow more, things don't turn out the way he wanted, borrow more and more, and finally he gets to the end of his rope. He realizes, I'm never going to be able to pay this back, and he's not only going to lose his job, but he finds out that the accountant, his boss, is coming to give an account, to go through his books and to find out if everything's in order. And it's certainly not in order. And he knows he's going to have to give an answer for what he's done. He's not only going to lose his job, most likely will spend the rest of his life in shame and in prison. So very discouraged, very depressed, realizes he's going to have to give an answer for this. He goes back through and goes to the ledger and adds up this massive sum that he owes, just to find out what is it that I'm up against. And he writes in the ledger, when everything is added up, he realizes it is an insurmountable debt. Never in a million years would he be able to pay this. And so he writes, at the end of this massive debt, he writes at the bottom of the ledger, such a debt, who can pay? And at this bottom point of great despair in his life, he decides the only way out for him is to take his own life. And so he gets his revolver and starts drinking to try to muster up the courage and thinks if I can get drunk enough, then I'll be able to pull the trigger. Instead gets so drunk he passes out before he can pull the trigger. Well, the legend has it that in the night, the Tsar was walking through camps, as he would often, dress up as a sort of like undercover boss. He would appear as if he was a lieutenant or something and just check in on his troops. And he stumbles in, sees the light still on this guy's tent, stumbles in, looks over the ledger, sees the guy passed out, sees the revolver, and puts everything together. Knows that this great debt's been stolen, kind of realizes everything, sees it all for what it is. Anyway, the next morning, kid wakes up and puts together what he's done the night before. He realizes he didn't have the courage or didn't have the sobriety to pull that trigger, and he looks around, glances at the ledger, and he sees something. Underneath the question, who can pay, is one signature, and the signature is Nicholas, the Tsar. The boy finally figures out what had happened, and sure enough, a day later, that entire sum is delivered to him to pay off all these debts. The story goes that the young man realizes, so this Tsar has not only seen this massive debt that I owe, he's seen me at my worst, but with this insurmountable debt that I can never pay. The Tsar didn't owe that debt. He did nothing wrong, but he signed his name as the only one who could pay and as the one who was willing to pay. What Christians believe is that on Good Friday, all of us in sin are really asking the same question. Who can pay? Who can stand before God and say that they've done it right, that they've gotten this life right, and they need no forgiveness? None of us. The Bible says that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So the question is, who can pay? And what Christians believe is on Good Friday is that Jesus himself signed his name to that debt, that he himself, not a czar, but a high king over the whole universe, he can pay. And that sacrificial death on the cross, those 2,000 years ago, Christians believe paid for a sin debt. An atonement was made for us in our salvation. Now, for that story to really add up, for that to sink in, three things need to be true. You need to be convinced of these three things. I could see somebody watching this video and say, well, but I'm not really convinced that I fall short of the glory of God. And if you're not convinced that you'll one day have to give an account, in other words, if you think we're all just accidents, you don't believe in God, it's sort of we just sort of happen, and when we die, we go in the grave, and that's it, then I guess the story wouldn't connect with you in any way. You have to be convinced that we'll have to give an account of our lives before God, and that we're going to fall short when that accounting happens. That we're all going to be uncovered, as it were. The Bible says that, as I said earlier, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. It means there's none righteous, no, not one. I don't know that I can convince you in a short YouTube video that all of us are going to be held accountable and going to fall short before God. I did hear a story told years ago by Francis Schaeffer about how when we stand before God, some people would say, but isn't morality relative? And how could he hold us accountable if we don't all know the Ten Commandments or we don't all agree on the Ten Commandments? There's a great illustration by Francis Schaeffer where he says, imagine standing before God and discovering that you've got a tape recorder around your neck. And God says, oh yeah, you've had that your whole life. Said, but I didn't see it. Well, it was invisible, but it's always been there. It's a very special tape recorder. This particular tape recorder only turns on. It only records when it hears you say the words or you think the thoughts, hey, you know what? You oughta, whatever. Or everybody should, or they should really, or I think people should. And anytime you said that, the tape recorder comes on. And so Francis Schaeffer imagines that scene in the courtroom, and God says, you know what? I won't even hold you responsible for the Ten Commandments. Let's just list every time you've made a standard for someone else to follow, and all I'm going to do is see if you perfectly followed the standards that you demanded from other people. Who of us would say we even got that right? Not only have we not got the Ten Commandments right, not only have we fallen short of the standards of God, we've fallen short of the standards we have for other people. The Bible calls that hypocrisy, when we demand something from somebody else, but we ourselves can't do it or aren't willing to do it. You have to be convinced that you'll give an account before God for that Good Friday cross, that story that Jesus paid for our sin debt to make sense. The other thing you have to be convinced of is that a sacrifice, a substitute can be made. You know, that may not be self-evident, that you may just think, well, Jesus died on the cross. Okay, you might even believe that. But did you believe he died on the cross for us, in our place? And for that, you could look all through the Old Testament where we see God set up this sacrificial system where a lamb dies in place of the people. A spotless lamb is a sacrifice, a substitute. In fact, our favorite stories, even for people who aren't believers, even people who aren't Christians, aren't our favorite stories those stories of self-sacrifice, where someone at great cost to themselves put someone else's needs ahead of their own? These great redemption stories of sacrifice, where someone died in their place or for their benefit. God sent Jesus to be that perfect sacrifice, that substitute for you and me. And lastly, you'd have to be convinced that of what I just said, that Jesus was in fact a perfect substitute. You might say, okay, I believe everybody's going to have to give an account of the way they live to God. And you might say, okay, and I'm even convinced that a substitute can be made, that payment can be made by another on my behalf. But are you convinced that Jesus was that perfect substitute? I mean, how do we know that Jesus' death on the cross was acceptable to God? And think of it as writing a check. I can write a check for a huge amount, but we won't know until that check clears whether or not it bounced or whether or not I was good for it, whether or not I had the resources. Well, in Jesus' case, he's dying on the cross to pay for all of sin, to live that perfect righteous life before God. How do we know that he did it? How do we know that he really was that spotless, blemishless lamb, that lamb without blemish before the Lord? How will we know? Well, on Good Friday, interestingly, we don't. We don't know that God approved of that sacrifice until 3 days later. And 3 days later, his resurrection is like the check clearing. It's like God saying, approved, payment made in full. And we know that God approved of the life and sacrificial death of Jesus, not because of just Good Friday, but because of Easter Sunday. And for that, we're going to have to come back. All you New Hopers, I hope to see you in a couple days at New Hope as we celebrate Easter. But I hope that helps give you a better idea of what's going on Good Friday. And I hope it helps you call to remembrance the great sacrifice that when we have to give an account before God, payment has been made on our behalf out of love, the love of God.